Okay, so Ethan, we have talked about doing something like this for a while. Back, I think a year or so ago, I interviewed you in a different setting, talking about the virtuous business leader and virtuous business model.
Yeah.
And it's something that super intrigued me, and I know you've been working on it and thinking about it and researching it and everything for a while now. So just kick it off. This is our very first episode. What brought up the idea and what got you interested in the idea of virtue and morality in business?
Okay, so to answer that, I have to go all the way back to whenever I started my doctoral program. I was at the very first residency meeting all the other scholars, and I sat through this session on, it was the virtuous business model, and which was developed at Indiana Wesleyan University. And I was talking to the guy who really headed up the development of the model itself. And at that particular time in my professional life, I was going through a big change. I had moved from a white-collar position in government into a blue-collar environment in transportation. And I was struggling mightily with adapting to the change in personnel that I was working with. So I just decided I was going to take these traits of a virtuous leader, take those back, apply them to myself, and see if I could gain any traction at all. And what I found was I certainly gained a lot of traction with the people that were within my department, but then that kind of crept out underneath the doors and really spread throughout the entire organization. As a result, I received a couple different promotions and stepped into a really prominent leadership position within that company. And so I think that the results speak for themselves. The culture took off there. I took off personally just from adapting those traits and trying to learn more about them. So that was really the seed that started everything.
That's awesome. So that got you kind of interested and like giving you a framework for it. Was there any experience in your life that you point back to and go, oh yeah, the idea of virtue and being virtuous is essential to leadership or essential to business?
So it was really that experience of struggling with leading people, which I had never, I had at that point in the time of my career, I had led people in a couple different organizations and it had no problem whatsoever. It was just whenever I got into a diverse environment where I really couldn't lead. I had zero traction, and it was an important position in a fast-paced environment, and it was pretty disturbing. I thought for sure that I had made a fatal career move and I was going to need to go do something different, which actually led me into the doctoral program, right? Because I was like, well, forget this, I'm just going to go teach. And so I enrolled in this doctoral program, and I was going to teach at a university and just push knowledge to students and be done with leading people. And little did I know I was going to go enroll in a doctoral program that prepared me for leading people, and then to take it one step further, pushed me into a position of really seeking out why morality is important in business in general, which, from talking to a lot of people, I found that people have this gut feeling that there's something missing or something a little bit off about how we transact business or the stuff that we consume. There's something just a little bit off about it. So I'm interested in researching that. I've been researching about it and writing about it. And I think it's going to be, as that matures, it's going to be super important to disseminate to people.
Yeah, completely agree. Just the interactions like we've had where you've kind of talked about some of the stuff and even just me seeing kind of a shift in your leadership just as being a friend has been really cool to see. And that's really what got me excited about it. So is there any, with that academic background, did that help spur you on in this? Was it more the personal side? Obviously, the professional is kind of what got you going into it, but where do you see it driving you now?
So certainly the academic side drove a lot of things, just because any sort of furtherance of education changes the way you view problems. And certainly a doctoral program is designed, so an undergraduate program will teach you skills, teach you technical skills to get a job done. A master's program teaches you a bit of a mix. You're still a practitioner, but you're kind of learning to step outside the box. And then a doctoral program is really, you're thinking outside the box. You're learning to research. You're learning to think abstractly and tie a lot of complex systems together. And so the academic piece certainly changed the way I think about things. So, I view capitalism totally different after I went through the doctoral program. It's just there's a lot more nuance, there's a lot more facets to the system that we operate in. And so that has driven me to not necessarily question capitalism in general, because I do think that it's the best system, but I'm not as big of an outspoken proponent of all aspects of a free market. Certainly, like I said, it's the best system, but there are some flaws in it. There are some issues when tangled up with immorality that causes some pretty, I'm not going to say evil, but pretty destructive things to occur. And if that is enmeshed with a social immorality as well, then we start celebrating those kinds of vices that are created, or maybe products or services that are not necessarily, they wouldn't have been thought of as above board 50 years ago or 60 years ago. So we're approaching an age where our generations before us struggle with how we interact with each other, economically speaking.
Mm-hmm. So obviously we're through this whole thing, we're going to dive into a bunch of these topics really in depth and really like pick these apart and just try to work them out. But until then, as we're moving through that, explain like what's the long-term goal here? Like what other than what we're doing here, are you looking to lecture, to write? What's kind of in the game plan?
So I've been researching and writing ever since I essentially arrived at my first residency in the doctoral program, that was in 2019. I was finished up by early 2023, and I've been researching and writing on this topic since then. So there's been a couple more, 2.5 years on top of that. So the overall objective, I guess, would be to answer that question that people have, that why do I feel like something's off? The virtuous business model put into place these traits of a virtuous leader or a virtuous organization. And I focused on virtuous leader, so I know it pretty well. And people understand why those traits are important. And maybe even we could go as far as to say how they work to build an appropriate leadership skill set that is effective at leading people. But we don't understand in this competitive environment that we call capitalism or a free market, we don't understand necessarily why that is important. Because one of the biggest challenges that I think virtuous leaders or business people interested in morality face, one of the biggest issues they face is, can I be moral or can I act with virtue and still be competitive? We don't necessarily know the answer to that. Maybe not, and that's a problem, right? And so that's the problem I'm researching. I would love to come up with the answer to that. And the answer to that has to include, well, where are we heading then if we can't compete and be virtuous or operate at some level of morality? So that's the direction. And what is that going to result in? I've been working on 2 different books, one with a couple of different authors, one by myself that approach this issue a little bit differently. And then I'm ultimately it's to educate people. That would be the objective.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm most excited about, and just us sitting down to have these conversations, is like diving into some of these existential questions that arise out of morality. The idea of morality and the idea of being virtuous, especially as a leader either in the marketplace or head of an organization or a team or whatever. So we wanted to like each of these episodes or each of these conversations pick up a couple of those questions and just kind of air them out and see what it could look like just to talk these things out and maybe not come up with an answer.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's not right. You solve all the world's problems here.
For sure.
But just kind of our initial conversation here and just hitting the 30,000 foot view of virtue and morality. Do you think virtue and morality is something that we as leaders discover, or do you think it's something that we create?
So that's an existential type question, right? That's a big question. Do we discover it or do we create it? I think that we have to discover it, just because virtue and morality existed before we did. So is it possible that we carve our own path with what we define as virtuous or moral? That's certainly the case. I think that probably the best evidence for that is a lot of people make decisions, personal or professional or otherwise. They make decisions off of really 2 criteria. Is it legal? And did I receive consent to do this? Or one or the other, right?
Which is such a low bar.
Right. Yeah. But if you think about it, so marijuana became legal here, I don't know when. And that's okay. That's fine. But nobody in the state, well, I'm not going to say nobody in the state, no legitimate businesses in the state were actively trying to push THC products before it became legal. You really didn't hear about it in the business community at all. And really the only time I heard about it in the business community was somebody was tied in with the legislature, so they were, this is immoral by the way, if you ask me, they were tied in with the legislature so they knew what was coming down the tracks before anybody else did. So they were getting their house in order to start businesses and to capitalize off of this whenever it happened.
Feels a little insider trading.
A little bit, yeah. So did they didn't, they certainly took advantage of that situation, which is immoral, but nobody else probably who owned dispensaries now had really probably given it much thought. And why? Because it's illegal. So we don't have permission to do that. That never got conflated with morality itself. Those 2 things never got mixed up. Is it legal? Sure. Okay, well, great. We can do it then. Should we do it? We never ask ourselves that question, or most people don't. They just go by the standard, well, if somebody gave me permission to do it, whether through legal terms or consent, well, it must be fine then, right? And so I think that we do carve our own path in those ways if we're not careful. But I that brings up an important point that Adam Smith, who I'm a big reader of, even though he's difficult to read and understand. So he was a economist, philosopher during the Scottish Enlightenment back in the late 1700s, and he wrote the book on capitalism, Wealth of Nations. He's called the father of capitalism, and he wrote some very specific rules, moral rules or virtues that we should follow in order to make this system work. And one of those is justice. And his definition of justice is passive. It's not like our definition of justice, which is think about criminal justice or punitive justice, something like that. His was passive, and the way he put it was, it's so passive that the only call is to not do harm to others. And I think that we totally missed the mark on that now. And so that I want to tie that into this discussion on, do we discover, do we create our own morality or virtue? Because we definitely don't create it, but we'll carve our own path to make ourselves feel comfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How do you think the impact of whatever current culture you're in, how do you think that deals with discovering or carving your path to morality?
So that brings up another great Adam Smith concept, which is the impartial spectator. So he talks about the impartial spectator in Theory of Moral Sentiments. So Adam Smith really wrote 2 books. He wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments, which started in the late 1750s, I think, and went through several different revisions all the way up to maybe the early 1790s. And this just covered really morality, human morality, how we should act and behave, and this concept of the impartial spectator is you should act as if you're viewing yourself through basically somebody else's lens. And that will point you towards appropriate behavior. So there's 2 parts to that, right? There's this internal part because you are viewing yourself, and so there's some internal constraints there that are supposed to constrain bad behavior. But then there's an external piece, so through the eyes of a peer. That's the external piece. And so you asked about current culture, current society. If that external piece is warped, because we live in a culture that's maybe accepting of things that maybe our own morals don't align with, that can still bend that perspective. You're viewing yourself through the lens of somebody else, and somebody else thinks it's totally okay to partake in whatever you're unsure whether you should partake in or not. And so that definitely, if you view the impartial spectator like that, that can definitely shape the way we make decisions, how we behave, good or bad. Yeah. So be careful who you surround yourself with, I guess. And be careful how much you allow yourself to be influenced by society and culture.
Yeah. It makes me think of if you go from wherever you're currently living, if you go from a rural area to a urban area, how does those 2 things change and butt up against each other? And then you have to wrestle with maybe discovering, okay, morality through that. I know we'll get to this in different conversations of like when you figure out like the virtues for yourself, like how do you stand by them, no matter where you're at or what situation arises. But yeah. I know that's something we'll talk about in the future. But just that's kind of where that took me to, of like, okay, if you're transplanted somewhere else, a different country, a different region of the country you're in, that could change.
Well, certainly, because community is important, although we're kind of eroding that. This particular set of generations that we have operating at the same time, the younger generations are eroding this sense of community. But assimilation is super important, and it's been important for people who've moved around the world for eternity, right? That they have to adapt to the culture that they move into. But you have to be careful about doing that. There are communities around the world who have done an excellent job of maintaining their sense of community. So think about the Jews, who are probably the most regularly displaced people throughout history. They've moved all over the world. They've been persecuted all over the world. But you can still find tightly knit communities of Jewish people who operate both personally and professionally at a super high level. Very successful group of people. And they don't stray from their central message too much. But they also seem to fit in although that they have been persecuted, they also seem to fit in and be contributors in whatever society that they happen to land in. So super important to do. You just have to be careful about how you do it and how much of your foundation you let get eroded.
Yeah, that's good. I know we'll dive into that more in the future, but to wrap up the episode, we'll do a more of a personal one.
Yeah.
Less of kind of talking out. But if you never studied or worked in business, do you think you still would have ended up like researching and diving into this topic?
So it's hard to imagine not being in business, because if you so at least the way I think about business is you're part of the larger economic system, right? That you are in some way partaking in that to extract some value for yourself. So I consider that business. So whether that be education or social work or medicine, whatever it is, I still think you're partaking in business. But to answer your question, had I not been in a strictly business role, in a finance role or whatever, do I think that I would have ran across virtue? Absolutely. Just because I'm so attracted to how our society is behaving. And it's way more about that than it is about the business side. The business side is actually fairly simple to figure out. It's the where are we headed as a society that is the complicated piece. Business is, like I said, business is relatively simple to figure out, especially if you take the guardrails off, which most people sadly do. Not everybody does, but especially if you're a growing company that's not established, you almost can't afford anymore to have guardrails on, guardrails of morality and virtue. It's very, very difficult to thread that needle and succeed because you're competing against people who don't have those rules. Super difficult to compete against. So answer that question, yes, I do think that I would have stumbled across this, although it may not have had its origins in business. But yeah, certainly would have came across it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to diving more into this and really like picking each of these pieces apart and learning more about it.
Yeah, cool.
Good chat.
Yeah.